So yeah, welcome everyone. This is so exciting. This is Transforming Anthropology's event as part of our 50th anniversary issue. It's titled Honoring Sheila S. Walker, Reflections on Anthropology and Afrocentrism Across the African Diaspora. And we are joined by Dr. Krystal Strong and Dr. Jemima Pierre. And I'm really excited. So my name is Savannah Kostnick, and I am one of the editorial assistants with Transforming Anthropology. And it is such an honor to be in this space with you all today. I am so excited just to be able to learn and kind of just be in conversation with so many folks today who have contributed so much to our discipline and just really moved us forward in our thinking so much. And so we're discussing the African diaspora today and our movements and kind of global dispersal and our connection to where we come from. We also want to take a moment to think about where we've come to as well. And so just to situate myself, I'm in Regina, Saskatchewan, which is the homeland of the Nahiawak, Anishinaabeg, Dakota, Lakota, Nakota, and the homeland of the Métis. And I'm just going to pass off to Chelsea now.
Hi, everyone. My name is Chelsea Carter. I am also an editorial assistant with Transforming Anthropology and a doctoral candidate in anthropology at Washington University in St. Louis. Similar to Savannah, I am joining you all today from Osage, Miami, Sioux, Iroquois land, also known as St. Louis. And Savannah and I want to acknowledge whose land we're on, but also acknowledge that we know that these acknowledgements are in fact insufficient to the more structural and colonial and imperial issues that continue to plague Indigenous people here in the United States, Canada, and worldwide. Our event today is a part of a series called Honoring Our Elders. The Transforming Anthropology Journal is hosting in honor of the 50th anniversary of the Association of Black Anthropologists. Our 50th anniversary issue that came out last fall celebrates Dr. Walker's article, The Virtues of Positive Ethnocentrism, originally published in TA in 1991. Our guests today, Dr. Strong and Dr. Pierre, each offer commentaries within that issue that we encourage you all to go read, reflecting on Dr. Walker's important contribution. I just want to go through a little bit of housekeeping. The Zoom is being recorded today, and we'll make that available to each of you on the TA YouTube page. We also do have a live captioner for the event. There's a tab to show / hide closed captioning, whether you need it or would like it to disappear from your screen. At the end of our more formal questions, there will be a Q&A period at the end, and questions will be addressed at that time. So please feel free during the conversation to put your questions in the Q&A box, and Savannah and I will select a couple of them and offer them to our panelists at the end.
So I am so honored I get to introduce our panelists today. So I'm going to begin with Dr. Pierre. So Dr. Jemima Pierre is an associate professor of African American Studies and Anthropology at UCLA. Dr. Pierre is a sociocultural anthropologist whose research and teaching interests are located in the overlaps between African studies and African diaspora studies and engage three broad areas: race, racial formation theory and political economy, culture and the history of anthropological theory, and transnationalism, globalization, and diaspora. She is the author of The Predicament of Blackness, Postcolonial Ghana and the Politics of Race. She is currently completing a manuscript whose working title is Racial Americanization, Conceptualizing African Immigrants in the US, and working on a project on the racialized political economy of multinational resource extraction in Ghana. Dr. Pierre's essays on global racial formation, Ghana, immigration, and African diaspora theory and politics have appeared in a number of academic journals, including Cultural Anthropology, Feminist Review, Social Text, Identities, Cultural Dynamics, Journal of Haitian Studies, Latin American Perspective, American Anthropologist, Philosophia Africana, and of course, Transforming Anthropology. Dr. Krystal Strong is an assistant professor at the University of Pennsylvania in the Literacy, Culture, and International Education Division, a member of the Anthropology Graduate Group, and a faculty affiliate of Africana Studies, the Price Lab for the Digital Humanities, the Center for Experimental Ethnography, and the Hub for Equity, Anti-Oppression, Research, and Development. Dr. Strong's research and teaching focus on student and community activism, the cultural and political power of youth, new media, and popular culture, and the role of education as a site of political struggle with a geographic focus on Africa and the African diaspora. She teaches courses in the education, culture, and society and international educational development programs that focus on global youth cultures, ethnography and qualitative research methods, decolonizing education, and grassroots community activism. As a scholar and active organizer in the city of Philadelphia, her hometown, Dr. Strong brings a commitment to local communities and the lessons of activism to bear on her scholarship and pedagogy.
I have the esteemed pleasure and honor of introducing Dr. Sheila Walker. We promised her we would not read this impressive bio verbatim, but we have to highlight some of the most important aspects of what she's brought to the world, but even more specifically, anthropology. Dr. Sheila Walker is a cultural anthropologist and filmmaker. She is currently Executive Director of Afrodiaspora Incorporated, a nonprofit organization that develops documentaries and education materials about the global African diaspora. She's done extensive field work, lectured, consulted, and participated in cultural events in much of Africa and the African diaspora. Dr. Walker was director of the Center for African and African American Studies, the Annabelle Iron Worshman Centennial Professor in the College of Liberal Arts, and Professor of Anthropology at UT Austin. She was also the William and Camille Cosby Professor in Humanities and Social Sciences, Professor of Anthropology, and Director of the African Diaspora in the World at Spelman College. She's edited several volumes, including African Roots, American Cultures, Africa and the Creation of the Americas, which was published in 2001. Knowledge from the Inside, Afro-South America Speak of Their People and Their Histories, which features chapters in Spanish and Portuguese by Afro-descendants from all Spanish-speaking countries in South America. She's also produced a documentary, Scattered Africa, Faces and Voices of the African Diaspora, which came out in 2001, and the film Slave Roots, a global vision for the UNESCO Slave Root Project. Her most recent documentary, Familiar Faces / Unexpected Places, a global African diaspora, was shown at the United Nations at the 2018 Black History Month program for the UN International Decade for People of the African Descent. Dr. Walker's legacy can be seen in her push to centralize Africa as not a remnant of the past, but as an important interlocutor of contemporary global politics in our contemporary moment. Please join us in welcoming our wonderful panelists.
Thank you so much. Wow.
You're impressive. What can we say?
My father always said, you got to do something.
Thank you so much all for joining us. And I just wanted to start off with a question. So for those of you who don't know, Dr. Walker helped to establish Transforming Anthropology when she was a grad student, and it was initially a journal, a newsletter, News from the Natives. And I had the opportunity to speak with Dr. Walker a few weeks ago, and she shared with me like the original volume 1, like first scanned copy. And in that issue, which 1973, that's when that was made, there's a little portion of it that I just wanted to read, just to like kind of preface my question. It says, so this is 1973, volume 1. One major problem of which many of the younger generation of Black anthropologists have become aware is our lack of knowledge of our intellectual genealogy. We do not know the senior generation of Black anthropologists. Since we can't tell by the names, we can't make the deliberate effort to seek out their works. Many of these Black anthropologists have suffered great obstacles and published significant books and articles with which we need to be familiar. So I find it so interesting that Dr. Walker was making this, you know, trying to bring attention to this in 1973, and here we are in 2021. And Chelsea and myself were not formally taught Black anthropology in our undergraduate or graduate programs. And so I guess the question is, like, why is it that we aren't learning our intellectual, Afro-intellectual history in our discipline, and I guess more broadly as well. Like with that push and with all the labor that has gone into trying to bring us to that work, why is it that there's still that kind of gap, and how might we like intervene in that in some way? And whoever wants to take that.
Well, I already said what I had to say. What I'm shocked by is that things haven't changed. You know, I mean, it was reasonable, okay, in 1973. I mean, it wasn't okay, but it wasn't as shocking as it is in 2021. You know how many years that's been? And there are two books, right? On the first generation of African-American anthropologists, on the second generation of African-American anthropologists. There are the articles by the late, great St. Clair Drake about the anthropologists and the para-anthropologists who were telling our stories. That all exists. And I'm really pleased that I got Drake to write those articles. I mean, he was a prolific speaker and he'd been every place when you needed to be in those places, but he didn't have time to write because he was doing other things. So I begged him. And as a result of my begging him, he wrote 3 articles that I think are really seminal for us to understand the history of Black folks, not just African Americans, Africans, people from the Caribbean, in the development of the discipline of anthropology. But I guess we can't count on anybody else to tell our stories. So it's up to us, I guess, to continue to insist that we need to tell our stories. We need to cite our elders, and we need to teach our stories to everybody. Because, for example, I went to the University of Chicago. When I was there, and I only learned this way later, St. Clair Drake, who had written the classic urban anthropology book, Black Metropolis, about Chicago, taught at Roosevelt University, about 20 minutes away from where I was. He was never mentioned by these people at what I had been told was the premier anthropology department in the United States. It was very disappointing to be there. Let me say that. So, we like to think things have changed, and a lot has changed. The fact that we are here, that's great evidence that things have changed, but not enough. I mean, when I was, first of all, thrilled, shocked, ecstatic that my article was chosen as groundbreaking. And I found it, went through all my stuff, right? And there's my 1991 article. I think it is absolutely relevant today, and it should not be relevant today. Things should have moved along. I mean, when I started to read it, I thought, oh boy, this is going to be old stuff. No. So those folks who commented on it, what do you think of, what are we going to do about also, not only what do you think of, but what are we going to do about the fact that we are not told our stories? Although there is the book on the first generation, there's the book on the second generation. Why aren't they used in anthropology departments? Why aren't they required?
Well, I thank you, Sheila. It's so great to see you. I haven't seen you so long, and I keep, looking at you. I'm like, I haven't seen you so long. It's so great. But and also I have to say, I wore red because Sheila loves red, and she always had on red, and so I remember that as a grad student. But yeah, I think you're right. I mean, we say this all the time, and part of it is anthropology. Is part of the broader, social structural system that we live in a white supremacist world, white supremacist society that replicates itself, right? And anthropology is one of the places where that continues. And so part of it is to acknowledge that and then do our own thing. And that's what I always appreciated with Sheila is she never, she always did her own thing, even, and I say this in my pieces, even as people were critiquing Afrocentrism and talking about essentialism in Africa, or those of us who talk about Africa were being essentialists, she did her own thing. And I think that's the lesson we have to learn is you don't wait for white people to cite you, right? You cite yourself, you cite each other, and then we keep it moving. And this necessity to ask for a seat at the table, for me, I don't want to be at that table, and we don't necessarily need it because we actually can take care of our own, and the work is there, the numbers are there, and we can just keep it moving. That's my view. I don't know what you're thinking, Krystal.
Well, I'm thinking along the same lines, and I have to say what an honor it is to be in this conversation with two women who just have meant so much to my own thinking and work. And I'm really regretting changing out of my red dress that I had on earlier. I told them earlier, but Anyway, I'm matching Sheila's wall in the background.
Yeah.
You know, there's something that Assata Shakur writes in her autobiography that I have literally, you know, in a poster on my wall that I think is relevant here. And she writes that no one is going to give you the education you need to overthrow them.
Yeah.
Right. And I think, you know, just tracing the genealogy of Black anthropological thought and contributions, and, you know, going back to some of those older seminal works, and, you know, the kind of manifesto-esque, you know, disposition of the works, which is really announcing itself and Black anthropologists as posing a threat to the white supremacy of anthropology. You know, of course, we know that representation matters. It's not sufficient, but it matters when you don't see Black people on your, you know, anthropological theory syllabus, you know, when you are starting an anthropology program, which was the experience that I had, right? You know, I went to Berkeley Anthropology, and, you know, after the transition of John Agbu, and never encountered his work on a single syllabus. You know, the department where he was a faculty member did not deem it fit to even engage with his work pedagogically. And so I think that this is unfortunate, but expected. And so that is why it becomes so important to do this work ourselves, right? Especially if Black anthropology, if we imagine it to have a politic that is about Black liberation, right? That, you know, we should expect this reception from this discipline and act accordingly.
You know, I was really enthusiastic about anthropology, and I still am. I still think that it is very useful, as obviously we all do. And I was a little, fortunately, I didn't start learning about anthropology in a classroom. I started learning about anthropology in Africa. I went to Bryn Mawr. Krystal and I were talking about this earlier. I was the last only colored girl in a Bryn Mawr class. So it wasn't horrible. You know, it was a cultural experience. But what it required, it made me need some balance. And so I found an exchange program, the Experiment in International Living. Obviously, most of the countries to which one could go were in Europe. But in my year, I could also go to Cameroon. So I went to Cameroon in Central Africa. And I lived with a family that at that point, this was shortly after independence, they were very Pan-Africanist. So that's where I learned about Pan-Africanism in Africa. And so the whole idea of essentializing Africa, I never had that possibility, because Africa started out as absolutely real. It was in Africa that I learned about the African diaspora, because these Africans who had not gone to a fancy college like I was doing at the time, they knew so much more about the world. They asked me all these embarrassing questions, right? Do you know about Sparrow from Trinidad? I'm from Jersey. You know, why am I supposed to somebody from a Caribbean island? Do you know about Pelé from Brazil? No. But, you know, I was cool. I didn't try to manifest my ignorance. But for them, this African diaspora was part of their sense of their extended African family. And I was a part of it. I learned there. And so that gave me a responsibility to diminish my ignorance some, and to begin to essentially study against my Eurocentric education. So that's where it began. And, you know, consciousness is irrevocable. So once you're on that path, you can't really get out of it. You can't back off and decide, oh, I'm just going to be colonized. Nah, it doesn't work. And in Chicago, my professors went out of their way to try to teach me that we, US African Americans, had no culture. Right? Famous sociologists were writing that, getting grants from famous foundations to write about us as a problem and insisting that we had no culture, whereas the United States government, starting in 1956, used our culture as what they call cultural diplomacy. That's how jazz got to be known around the world. Jazz was acknowledged by President Eisenhower, not a major leftist radical, as the high culture of the United States. So the hypocrisy of it all is, I guess, the continued hypocrisy of it all is what's so shocking. And understanding how present Africa has remained in the Americas, how fundamental African knowledge was to the technological, intellectual, civilizational creation of all of the Americas, Chile to Canada. That's what America means to me. It doesn't mean United States. How can that all be left out of the story and have people think that they're telling the story, the universal story, right?
Absolutely, Dr. Walker. Can you share with us a little bit about kind of what influenced your kind of notion of positive ethnocentrism and how that shaped kind of the way you oriented your work within your TA essay? And then also for Dr. Pierre and Dr. Strong, how you've taken up positive ethnocentrism and Afrocentrism at large within your work and your lives as anthropologists.
Okay, I need to make a linguistic comment. I did obviously say I was Afrocentric at the time. And when we had that meeting, I was at the College of William and Mary at that point, having been at Berkeley, which was quite a difference, University of California, Berkeley. I don't think I expected to say all I said at that event, but as I was hearing my colleagues say, oh yes, we need to stop being ethnocentric, I began to think, wait a minute, they need to stop being ethnocentric. I need to become even more Afrocentric because I need to learn my stories that they are denying. So they're denying my identity, they're denying my worldview. And in the context of doing the book, African Roots, American Cultures, Africa and the Creation of the Americas, I found that I needed a term. And, you know, I know some linguistic rules, so I made up a term that works, which is Afrogenic. And my definition of Afrogenic that's in African Roots, American Culture is, and I will read this, I don't remember it, Afrogenic simply means growing out of the histories, ways of being and knowing, and interpretations and interpretive styles, that's very important, of African and African diasporan peoples. It refers to these communities' experiences, priorities, and styles, and their articulations of them while acknowledging that most human behavior is not intellectually articulated by the actors who perform it, and that plural interpretations of similar behaviors are obviously possible. So I needed my own word, and I needed my own word that really questions the whole issue of these centrisms, right? How am I going to be anything other than Afrogenic, given that that's who I've always been, given that it's my African ancestors who have determined all of my experiences in the United States and in the rest of the world, as well as those experiences of other people of African descent in the world. So with that as a worldview, I didn't have much choice but to continue viewing the world through my own eyes, through the eyes of my own ancestors. And, you know, it could be said, oh, you had other ones. Do they count? In the United States, with the one-drop rule, only our African ancestors count for who we are. And that's true for all of us in the global African diaspora. And Africans, I think, know that it's the fact of their Africanity that situates them in the world. So I've, you know, one of my, I said to my advisor at the University of Chicago that I thought that I would like to do my research in an African or African descendant society. And he assured, why? Well, because, you know, I've been so welcomed in Africa and taken into this family. I've been so welcomed in other African diasporan societies. They and we have seen the connections. And he assured me that I would have no special access to any African or African diasporan society. So when I visited my Cameroonian family after that, I told them that and they said, what? We saw you as a daughter. We would see him as a colonizer. So that's how my path was traced. And, you know, we have so much work to do to tell our own stories from our own perspectives that I don't have time to do anything else. And we have this wonderful world to deal with. I've been writing a memoir for a long time about the impact of going to Africa when I was 19 and having my worldview determined then. And so I've been working on this forever, and it's been evolving. But an editor said that an agent who was allegedly interested in my work characterized it as my story of a Black woman making it in a white world. And I thought, what? I don't think she understood anything. She was so blinded, I guess, by her worldview that she couldn't see mine. Because what my story was, a white world in which the majority of the human beings on the planet are not white? Where does she live? You know? So my reality has always been Africa and an increasing knowledge of the global African diaspora.
I think that's great. It's so hard to follow Sheila, though, you know, to talk this way. But I do appreciate that, because I too, you know, coming from Haiti and moving to the U.S. when I was younger, and then my first trip out of the U.S. was to Ghana, right, when I was still an undergrad, and landing and feeling like I was back in Haiti, because I hadn't been in Haiti in 10 years. And really understanding a particular kind of connection that I didn't have in the U.S., you know, with people, and also feeling invisible, which is good actually, in that space. But like Sheila, I actually came to Pan-Africanism with my Ghanaian buddies, who actually taught me about the history of Pan-Africanism when I was at the University of Ghana. Participating in events and so on. And so coming back to the US then, and then starting graduate school later, and part of it is I have to historicize this, because I started grad school in the late 90s when there was this really big backlash against Afrocentrism. And partly because, and I say this in the piece, partly because people equated Afrocentrism with Molefi Asante, right? And not with Du Bois, who actually coined the term Afrocentric, right? Mm-hmm. But also, and then not with the way Sheila describes Afrogenics, you know, Afrocentrism in that piece, that this, you know, this celebration of the connections of Black people across the world, right? And recognition and celebration. And so I spent the entire grad school fighting against being called an essentialist because I was interested in Africa, right? And I do think there's something to be said about that, because if you go back just 20 years earlier, that wasn't the case. When you think about Sinclair Drake, you think about, you know, and I have to say I was trained by Sinclair Drake's, you know, students, you know, UT Austin, where we all were. So we had a very distinct anthropological experience. But it is interesting to me that just a decade earlier, you know, this connection, the conversations around African cultural continuities in the diaspora, connections between, you know, Afro-Atlantic dialogue, as Matori calls it, right? These conversations were always ongoing and transformative to both sides. That just disappeared to me by the late 90s when we started graduate school. And so it was really shocking to come from Ghana to start graduate school and then be told that, you know, thinking this way was an essentialist way of thinking. And so I do think my entire career, and I say this in the piece as well, has been fighting against that, you know, that. But then I thought about Sheila when I reread her piece for this celebration. I was like, I wasted all this time fighting against something I didn't have to. I could have just gone on and kept up to my business and did what I needed to do. And so, so it's just really interesting to think about what we spend our time arguing against for the sake of, you know, very specific sets of intellectual and political positions.
It is so wonderful to just hear how we come to this work. I don't think as scholars we hear enough about these kind of genealogies. And if you haven't read it, Sheila has a wonderful article called Milestones and Arrows. A cultural anthropologist discovers the global African diaspora, which, at times you learn about lives and bodies of work such as Sheila Walker's, and you're just like, it's almost baffling how vast it is. And I have elders here who are also scholars or activists who have these vast Pan-African lives, and it's so just wonderful to read and even listen. And I think in that piece you call them your itineraries of discovery. And so anyway, having said that, I come similarly to what's been described. I come to Afrocentrism, positive ethnocentrism, not as an intellectual project or a professional praxis. I come to it as a Black woman who was once a Black girl growing up in a Black city that understands itself as Pan-African in very intentional ways. So my encounter with Afrocentrism is Odunde, which is the largest African street festival in North America here in Philadelphia. I come to it through Freedom Theater, right? Which was this incredible performing arts space that really groomed me and helped me to understand myself as an African first in America. And so, later, it's particularly, I think there's an interesting sort of study abroad, through line in our stories, because I too, as an undergraduate, traveled to Ghana my first year of college. It was my first time, going to the African continent. I traveled to Brazil and was struck by how African it was.
Oh, yeah.
I had the opportunity to study for a semester in Ghana at Legon. And, those really, those were the things that brought me to anthropology, right? I was really trying to figure out, how do I connect with, learn with, struggle with, be with African people? And so that's what anthropology was for me in the first instance, right? And so I think initially when I was approaching the commentary, I was really thinking about that. And I was thinking about how and why Africa seems to be dislocated from so much of Black scholarship and so much of how we think about Black people in the world, particularly from, the diasporic side of the academy. But then, my interests and my thoughts changed this past summer in the midst of this incredible resurgence of Black insurgency, right? And, we're in a pandemic. I mean, we're still in a pandemic, obviously. But, I think about this past summer, which for me as an organizer is one of the most just treasured periods of my life as an organizer, to see Black people in this land rising up at the level that we were, the conversation around abolition and how close at hand a certain kind of freedom felt this past summer. But at the same time, one of the things that felt so present in your piece in rereading it was the dynamic you described in that seminar is exactly what so much of us experienced after the murder of George Floyd and the, solidarity statement industrial complex and the task force industrial complex and the ways that our institutions exhaust us by pretending to care about our lives, right? And we know that nothing will come from it. And so to me, rereading that piece, and there was a part that I sat with for days after, in the midst of all of these things. And you write, let's see here, I had it saved. I am ethnocentric, And I have absolutely no intention of ridding myself of my ethnocentrism because I like it.
Love it.
And I, unfortunately, this conversation and the last TA conversation, there's this UT Austin FOMO that I now feel. Like, why didn't you go to UT Austin? You would have had to fight the battles you fought in a department where African studies is done by white people, which is a fundamentally different orientation, right? And so what brings me to anthropology is kind of forced in a way to be a kind of hidden agenda as opposed to an explicit agenda. And so when I read you say, I have no intention of ridding myself of my ethnocentrism because I like it. You talk also about how your people and this culture are sufficiently fascinating to make them and it the center of my research career as a professional anthropologist. And then you talk about ecstatically participating in the many manifestations of that cultural orientation. I was like, man, it was I'll be honest, it was a lifesaver to me in a lot of ways, because yes, there is the part of positive ethnocentrism that is about the way that we understand ourselves as Black people. But what got me, particularly at the time of writing this, was I like it. And there's something about, that self-possession, that I'm going to do me-ness that I think is so important for us as, Black folks who choose to be in anthropology, who choose to be in the academy, when there is so much work for us to do as Black people. And so I just want to say thank you for writing that, and the kind of permission that offers, I think is so important and is not something that we see enough.
Wow, thank you. And thank you for citing my very highly academic language. That reminds me of something for which I was highly criticized in academia: popularizing.
Right.
Now, that word was even more of an anathema in academia than essentialism, right? But, I did that because, and I was criticized by some of my elders for, well, why are you writing for essence? Why are you writing for ebony? Because a lot of people read Essence and Ebony. And I felt that, and read, as that as an African-American anthropologist, having had all of my interesting experiences in Africa, elsewhere in the diaspora, that it was a responsibility of mine to share that knowledge and to share it as broadly as possible, and to share it in venues in which regular folks, not the rare breed of academics, read it, understood it, and understood their own lives better, and sometimes made changes in their lives. I met a young African-American woman, young at the time, as was I, who said, I read your article on Bahia in Essence. I had to go there. I wrote an article on African-American naming that was in Ebony. And I got letters from people saying, my name is Cuffy. I didn't know that was African. My name is Kwashi. I didn't know I had an African name. And in talking about, I need to refer back to the issue of essentialism, because it was real, and it's still real. African Americans, African diasporans, in our efforts to know Africa, but without the privilege that we have had in actually being there and having our Afrogenicity founded in African experiences, have created an Africa that, is not exactly the Africa that we know. When I was in grad school, Africans spoke Swahili. Well, I had a problem with that. I knew that wasn't true. And I also understood why we felt the necessity to create another set of norms for ourselves, Afrogenic norms in reality, but not based on any kind of real Africa, but based on a truly essentialized Africa. And so it's up to us to fight against that too. But I have found it really rewarding to share the kind of information that we gather, that we generate, and that we need to, that we're supposed to constrict into articles for the Journal of Obscure Affairs that nobody reads. So, I mean, currently my goal is to share us as broadly as possible. Nicolas Guillen, Afro-Cuban poet, said, "Sin conocernos nos reconoceremos," in one of his poems. I don't love the rest of the poem. I just use the part I like. And it was in going to other places in the African diaspora, to translate that, without knowing each other, we will recognize each other. Without going to place elsewhere in the African diaspora, I wouldn't have been able to understand us, because I recognized me in them, and they helped me see my US African American denied, although pervasive and highly appropriated culture. In Brazil, going to candomblé ceremonies, I understood getting happy at Hopewell Baptist Church in Newark, New Jersey, that I had not understood because no one could give me an Afrogenic interpretation. The interpretations that people gave me were just Christianity. I'm like, you know, that's not adequate. Going to the Pacific coast of Colombia, where Afro-Colombians have names like Mandinga, Casaman, Ayobi, Biafara. And when you ask them, well, tell me about your name. Oh, it's Spanish. I'm not sure it's Spanish. They inspired me to find out about my African family name. My great-grandmother, the Indian, back when we didn't have any African ancestors, they were all Native Americans, you know, with that long straight hair. I knew my great-grandmother. I knew her. I didn't know her name was Amelia Congo. Nobody told me that part. So it's only, in my experience, by knowing ourselves in the world that we can know ourselves at all. And, you know, how can Africans know themselves in the world if they don't know what happened to Africa? They have to know me to understand themselves, just like we need to know them to understand ourselves. So that's all. And oh, let me say something about, in addition to, words are really important. The first time I saw Molefi Asante talk about his Afrocentrism, the word that stuck in my head was agency, that Black folks had agency. Because in my graduate education, I was supposed to read books like Stanley Elkin's book, is it called Slavery? That says that African Americans were passive, Sambo personalities. And I thought, passive? So that whole issue of agency, you know, all that, oh, we accepted slavery because, you know, all those myths of, yeah, Africans were adapted to that. Well, that's just not true. And were it true? I mean, the whole use of the term slave, suggesting that passivity. Aimé Césaire, one of the fathers of negritude, talked about the chosification, the thingification. Well, I'm not about to thingify my ancestors. On the contrary, if you think about all that these presumably passive people did in the Americas, creating new languages, the Creoles of the Americas, okay? Creating new spiritual systems, bringing all that gold technology, all that agricultural technology to the Americas. Passive? Give me a break. But we had been told that they were passive, and we didn't have a basis for understanding all that they contributed, all that they brought, all that they implemented, and all that we still have on a daily basis. Teaching at the University of Texas, right? Obviously, most of the people I taught about the African diaspora were not visible African diasporans in the contemporary sense of the term. And so students would say to me, I have blonde hair and blue eyes. I'm white. Why am I interested in this? And then after your class, I realized, you know, I use African words every day when I say, wow. You know, and so these white students said, I too can be proud of my African heritage. They got it. They got it that Africa is pervasive. Now we will see, you know, we got all these recent allies as a result of, I think, the embarrassment on the part of some of our paler compatriots about their ignorance of who we are. Not that we know enough about who we are, but the kinds of questions, you know, what? We've been here for a long time and you don't know that yet? Wow, that's been kind of shocking. And so now the issue is how many of our allies are going to continue to be our allies. You know, there's all this talk about we have to get rid of white superiority. Well, okay, good. It's not up to us. You know, that's not our problem, right? That's somebody else's problem. Our problem is understanding our huge global story and telling it and sharing it with us and with them, all of them. And knowing that humanity, all of modern humanity is African, period. So sometimes I give talks and I ask, who's of African origin? And there are always people who raise their hands and say, me, irrespective of appearance. And there are people who don't raise their hand. And so I have to ask those others, you know, I need to know who I'm talking to, right? Well, what planet are you from? If your ancestors are not part of the modern humans, Homo sapiens sapiens, who all evolved on the African continent.
I love this. How do you top that?
I get carried away. Sorry.
No, I had to quickly say though, you pointed something out, Sheila, that has always pained me because we're so much harder on ourselves, and the critiques of Black people who are trying to claim some kind of African heritage was always so much more than the critiques of white supremacy to me. And a lot of the times was just like, oh, you don't know Africa. And then, you know, the white Africanists would tell you, you know, right. We also forget that African studies became white only in the 60s. But before that, it was the Black people doing, you know, the Black folks at Howard, right? Yes. Doing African studies. And so part of that is, you know, Black students are told that they don't know anything about Africa, and whatever they're doing, trying to create that connection or acknowledge it, there's something wrong with that. And a lot of people spend a lot of time critiquing African Americans in particular, and those from the diaspora, for trying to find this heritage or trying to claim it. And I do think we do need to step back and think about, and I love the way you was like, of course it makes sense to create an essentialist Africa. We haven't been given, you know, another option. And I so appreciate you saying that, because it's just been so frustrating, you know, to write and talk about Africa and have this castigation upon, you know, our people.
Yeah.
I love this point too so much because, you know, without an essentialist Africa encounter, many of us would not even be doing the work that we're doing in the first place. Mm-hmm. And particularly, I mean, one of the things I appreciate so much about Jemima's work, and really the way you trace that fragmentation that happens when African studies becomes white is such important history to understand how things came to be the way that they are. And then, you know, you think about what's happening on the cultural terrain. And you know, there's a part in the Virtues of Positive Ethnocentrism where Sheila is really describing who her people are.
Right, I love that.
And I love it so much because
right?
Right, the concentric circles.
Right.
And, you know, what's very interesting to me and what is very troubling to me is the way those circles have become so much smaller.
Yeah.
Like at the collective level, at the popular level. And, you know, what's the political effect of that?
Right? Krystal, explain the circle for people. Explain how she.
Oh, I'm sorry. So there's a part, and I'm just going to pull it up really quickly. It's in, you know, she's describing my people, the people that she's so ecstatically, you know, focusing her professional career on. And she talks about the inner circle being African Americans, and then it widens to include people of African descent, right? It's this kind of articulation of a truly Pan-African understanding of self, right? So Blackness and Africanness are, you know, occupying the same space, where I think we can talk about some of the politics of Black identity today. And I don't know that we can really say that, particularly when you see the rise of ADOS, African descendants of slaves, this whole notion of being a foundational Black in America, and what that politically means, right? What that enables or disables us from doing collectively, right? In understanding our conditions. And so I just so appreciate the naming of that and the historicizing of that. And also recognizing that there is a place for a kind of a strategic essentialism, right? That is a starting point, not an end point.
If I think of this, the essentializing of Africa that I began when the 80s or so, I guess Africans had to start recreating a new Africa in the Americas as soon as they arrived. They had to recreate identities. They had to recreate cultures, which involved creating new cultures. And so all over the Americas, African descendants created new cultures, new spiritual systems. And what did they have to work with? What they remembered from Africa. And if we think about who was enslaved, these were young people, they were brought to work. They were not the elders who had all the information. So these were folks who didn't have all the information, but they had what they had. And with what they had, if we look at all they created throughout the Americas, I mean, it's incredible. And there's some places where our Africanity is so flagrant, like parts of Brazil. I mean, there's no, you can't get away from it, right? But for me, it was a result of going to those places that I could see me. And it was in doing this book, an edited volume, I thought I had learned with African Roots American Cultures to never do another edited volume. And then I lost my mind and did another edited volume en Espanol. I studied Spanish for a year in a previous century, right? And I undertake this project, not alone though. This was sponsored by the United Negro College Fund Global Center to involve people from HBCUs. I had just left Texas and gone to Spelman, and to enable people from HBCUs to do projects with Afro-Latins, whatever definition of that odd term, Latin, a dead European language, right? But I thought, I can't write about them. I'm from Jersey. Okay, I can write with them. And so I involved Jesus Garcia, who is a major Afro-South, let's use geography, Afro-South American Venezuelan researcher. And he was a diplomat also. He was the Venezuelan representative to Angola, to Mali. He was in Louisiana. He was a consular officer to Louisiana until things changed. But so together, we got together people from all the Spanish-speaking countries in South America to have them write about their cultures. And none of these folks was an anthropologist. None of these folks was a trained researcher. That's a privilege they didn't have. Most of them didn't go to college. That was not a privilege they had in places like Argentina, where, as we have been told, there are no Black folks, there never were, irrespective of the fact that at the beginning of the 1800s, a huge percentage of Buenos Aires lived in the barrio Candombe, Candombe meaning things having to do with Black folks, in spite of the fact that the national dance of Argentina, tango, has a Bantu name. So yet the president of Argentina a couple of years ago at the Davos Economic Summit said, oh, we're Europeans. Why did they dance the tango? But so Jesus Garcia and I got these folks together to write their stories, which they knew even less than we know ours, because they have much less access to information. We exist, right? They're told they don't exist. And I actually met people, and they shocked me, in Paraguay and Mexico, who said, oh, I'm not Black. Okay. So let's discuss this. Afro-Mexicans in California who say, no, I'm Mexican, I'm not Black. Well, you look Black. Oh no, I'm dark, but I'm not Black. But they don't know their story, and they don't have access to knowing their story. We do have that access. But what they did, and all of these people, irrespective of having no training whatsoever, all the countries in South America, including the Southern Cone, where they allegedly don't exist, the Afro-Paraguayans who don't exist, according to Encyclopedia Britannica, the Afro-Argentinians who don't exist, Bolivia? No, come on. Chile? Of course not. They all came, they all told their stories, and they all learned what their ancestors had created in all of those countries. And they all found that their African ancestors had created some kinds of new institutions that involved what they brought from Africa, what they found, how they transformed what they found, how they Africanized Christianity, for example. Go to Brazil and look at what the Afro-Brazilians did with the saints. You know? Saint Barbara, oh yeah, that's Yansan. Okay. So I think, you know, the longue durée, right? The long term of our story. I agree with Jemima. We need to be a little more tolerant about ourselves and understand ourselves. But I think if we understand ourselves in the big picture, it makes it a lot easier. And to speak about those African studies departments that were created in the 1960s as a result of the National Defense Education
Department, yes.
Yeah. What were those? That was Cold War politics.
Yeah, spying.
Yeah. So there was a whole lot of Cold War politics throughout the 60s. It was communism or capitalism, the United States or the Soviet Union. And Africa was a pawn in all that. And so the National Defense Education Act was about creating Afro studies programs so that we could learn about Africa, so that we, in the sense of the United States, could define Africa in a way that served the interests of the United States, the West, as opposed to those other people over there. So Africa was really a pawn. So those departments were not made to learn about Africa for us or for Africans. You know, we just need to, it's very important to know that genealogy, that intellectual genealogy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Walker. Thank you. We have a question from the audience, and we were thinking we're pretty much out of time, but if y'all...
That's it, we're just getting started.
Yeah.
This is just part one. Can we come back to part two?
Yeah.
I'm just gonna ask the question from the audience member, if y'all want to jump in and respond to that. It says, Sheila, can you talk a bit about the role of African American culture in the diaspora, including our privileged position by virtue of the power of American cultural imperialism in the world? And I'm sure Dr. Strong and Dr. Pierre, if you want to respond to that as well.
You know, doing this book with these Afro-South Americans, I couldn't have done it without my Afro-Venezuelan colleague and buddy and co-compliciter in a lot of activities. Because then I would have been the hegemonic North American coming in with money from North America, saying to these folks in the South, hey, I want you all to write your stories, okay? But he and I were equal in this. You know, I got the money because, you know, I'm the hegemonic North American, but we were equal, other than the fact that I got the money. And I wound up editing the book because he had to go off and become a diplomat, which was wonderful. It wasn't like Venezuela had a whole lot of Afro-Venezuelan diplomats prior to his role. But so we, from North America, one, we do need to acknowledge our importance in the diaspora. We are role models. That is true. Our civil rights movement was really significant for everybody else in the Americas. Our heroes, Martin Luther King, Angela Davis, Malcolm X, you know, you had a variety of possible perspectives there. Brazil, in Brazil, during the period of real oppression, dictatorship, thank you, under the dictatorship, Afro-Brazilians couldn't talk about racism. And so what did they do? They started identifying with African-American music. They had gatherings that were called Black Rio not Rio Negro, Black Rio. And so they were identifying with our struggle, seeing our struggle as similar to theirs, although they had been told that they lived in a racial democracy, not a segregated society like the United States. But they were using our culture as an arm to fight against the dictatorship, essentially, and the amazing racism, like in Brazil, in a country that is majority of African origin. The government has had to acknowledge that as of the most recent censuses, because it's not just the most recent, it's the previous one also, that more than 50% of the population identifies as Black or brown. They don't have, the simple binary that we have. In a place with no one drop rule like we have, more than half the population says, oh yeah, I'm in. That's part of my reality too.
I wanted to thank you, Sheila. I think it's important to acknowledge the significance of African-American, the dispersal of African-American cultural practices throughout the world. And part of that, of course, we know, diplomacy, right? The US government using African-American culture, flying people over, to play and so on. And so I do think there is that. And I do think there is this, there's this amazing recognition of that throughout the world. I do think though, as people living in the US, what we also need to, in addition to recognizing that African-American culture is all over the world, but to also use our position within the heart of the empire to actually fight against US imperialism abroad, right? And so part of that is like, we are in the heart of it, and we should be able to fight against, the US promotion of like Museveni, Uganda, what's happening in Haiti. And so I do think, there's a way that we can use the position that we have here, but much more than just cultural things, because it is the proximity, you're right, to empire that has allowed African-American culture to disperse and the privilege. But we also, a lot of us have known this, right? That the responsibility also is to fight against the empire on behalf of our brothers and sisters, I think. And I think that to me, that's how I would answer that question, the both sides of it.
And that's exactly where I wanted to go with it as well. Because what I hear in both of the responses is a kind of political and ethical imperative, right? And a responsibility, really, in recognizing, proximity to empire, and recognizing, and that's not just empire in abstract sense, but the US Academy as an articulation of that empire, right? And, I think one thing that I would have loved us to talk a little bit more about, and, I would love a second conversation, or as many conversations as we need. I think we can see in some of the unconventional projects that I know both of you have taken on, and I myself have attempted these efforts to do just that, whether it's through film projects, or you talked about the public scholarship. I'm thinking about the Black Agenda Review, for example, and something very recently I've worked with others to co-convene a Pan-African activist solidarity network that does popular education. And so I think, once we, of course, we've been talking quite a bit about the sort of cultural terrain and landscape and identity questions. And, that is so important, and it's a precondition in many ways. But at the same time, when we are talking about policing and anti-Blackness in the US, it is, not only is it incomplete, but it's irresponsible to articulate that without also connecting that to a larger story about global white supremacy and empire. I mean, even looking at policing in the US and not having some kind of discussion of AFRICOM and militarization of the African continent, or global US imperialism, right? And so these are things that we can do and we must do, not just in our scholarship, but I think I'm very interested in thinking about how we are connecting to African people that are in Africa, how we are, collaborating, how we are citing, how we are redistributing resources, how we are engaging in, solidarity practices, how we are amplifying and lifting up struggles that are happening, particularly when we recognize that a hashtag trending, it actually provides protection for people who are risking their lives, right? So these things have very real and material consequences.
Totally agree. Yeah, I think that we, we have access to the information that can bring us together and to help us. I mean, if we think about policing, okay, George Floyd needs to be beatified, sanctified, become an orisha, a loi, because his death has unveiled so much. I don't know if we would have known about Beto being beat to death at Carrefour in Porto Alegre in southern Brazil had it not been for George Floyd. We wouldn't have known about Michel Ziegler being beaten by the police in Paris for having such a nice office in such a nice neighborhood. What was he doing there? So I think that what has become clear is that, yeah, global white supremacy, global police violence, unfortunately, in Africa also, against Africans who are on the wrong side of the regime. So we have to use our scholarship in ways that are pragmatic. And I don't really think we have much of a choice. I mean, I'm really concerned right now with the issue of how is the world being taught? You know, we in the United States are still, I'm not sure that the educational system has changed noticeably, such that the fact that the majority of the people who created the Americas came from Africa, that's basic. Why don't we know that? So how are we going to just change the educational system, change the mindset, change the, education is compulsory, right? So we're being force-fed lies. And not we in the United States, right? We in the Western Hemisphere based on genocide and slavery. If we know the how it all started, then it becomes pretty simple to understand. So I think that one of the areas in which we need to have more impact here in Africa, Africa needs to know its story. It needs to know that those countries are fake. They were created in Berlin at the Treaty of Berlin in 1885. No African was at the table at that point. So what the West sees, oh, those dysfunctional Africans, they have these fake structures imposed upon them. They had their own structures before. They had empires, they had kingdoms, they had much more democratic societies before. Do they all know that? Or are they also victims of a compulsory education, racism, colonialism, white superiority is white superiority. But I do like to think that some of our new allies are going to join the struggle and understand what their responsibility is too, their ethical responsibility, their political, their human responsibility. Having benefited, don't they have some responsibility to try to rectify the story? And it's not our story, it's everybody's story. Everybody's in this story. We're in different positions. So I hope that our allies will step up to the plate.
Thank you so much, Dr. Walker, for that amazing response. And thank you to Dr. Strong, Dr. Pierre. This has been truly incredible. I hate to wrap it up. We could go on and on and on. This is such an important conversation, and I'm so grateful that we've had this space together and this opportunity to learn from your rich scholarship and just to be full of so much wisdom. So thank you, everyone. We're gonna wrap up. And again, thank you to all of our panelists. Thank you for all the attendees for coming and contributing to this conversation. And yeah, it's just so much gratitude, so thank you. And also thank you to TA, the team as well, for helping put this together. So just thank you so much, everyone. This has been truly spectacular.
Thank you all. And I propose that this be the beginning of a series. I think that's part of our ethical, political, intellectual, and Afrogenic responsibility.
That would be great.
Okay. Awesome.
Mic drop there. Mic drop there.
Thank you so much, everyone. Hope you have a lovely rest of your day. Take care.
All right, take care.
I thank
Everyone.